Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb. Prologue. The Tangle. Malkin abruptly heaved himself out of his wallow, with a wild thrash that left the atmosphere hanging thick with particles. Shreds of his shed skin floated with the sand and muck like the dangling remnants of dreams when one awakes. He moved his long, sinuous body through a lazy loop, rubbing against himself to rub off the last scraps of outgrown hide. As the bottom muck started to once more settle, he gazed about at the 24 other serpents who lay basking in the pleasantly scratchy sediments. He shook his great maned head and then stretched the vast muscle of his length. "Time," he bugled in his deep-throated voice. "The time has come." They all looked up at him from the sea bottom, their great eyes of green and gold and copper unwinking. Shriver spoke for them all when she asked, "Why?" "The water is warm here, the feeding easy. In 100 years, winter has never come. Why must we leave now?" Malkin performed another lazy twining of himself. His newly bared scales shone brilliantly in the filtered blue sunlight. His preening burnished the golden false eyes that ran his full length, declaring him one of those with ancient sight. Malkin could recall things from the time before all this time. His perceptions were not clear, nor always consistent. Like many of those caught twixt times, with knowledge of both lives, he was often unfocused and incoherent. He shook his mane until his paralyzing poison made a pale cloud about his face. He gulped his own toxin in, breathed it out through his gills in a show of truth vow. "Because it is time now," he said urgently. He sped suddenly away from them all, shooting up to the surface, rising straighter and faster than the bubbles. Far above them all, he broke the ceiling and leaped out briefly into the great lack before he dove again. He swam about them in frantic circles, wordless in his urgency. "Some of the other tangles have already gone," Shriver said thoughtfully. "Not all of them, not even most, but enough to notice they are missing when we rise into the lack to sing. Perhaps it is time." Susuria settled deeper into the muck. "And perhaps it is not," he said lazily. "I think we should wait until Auburn's tangle goes. Auburn is steadier than Malkin." Beside him, Shriver abruptly heaved herself out of the muck. The gleaming scarlet of her new skin was startling. Rags of maroon still hung from her. She nipped a great hank of it free and gulped it down before she spoke. "Perhaps you should join Auburn's tangle. If you missed out Malkin's words, I, for one, will follow him north. Better to go too soon than too late. Better to go early, perhaps, than to come with scores of other tangles and have to vie for feeding." She moved lively through a knot made of her own body, rubbing the last fragments of old hide free. She shook her own mane, then threw back her head. Her shrill trumpeting disturbed the water. "I come, Malkin. I follow you." She moved up to join their still circling leader in his twining dance. Overhead, one at a time, the other great serpents heaved their long bodies free of clinging muck and outgrown skin. All even Susuria rose from the depths to circle in the warm water just below the ceiling of the plenty, joining in the tangles dance. They would go north, back to the waters from whence they had come, in the long ago time that so few now remembered. Midsummer, Chapter 1, of Priests and Pirates. Kenneth walked the tideline, heedless of the salt waves that washed around his boots as they licked the sandy beach clean of his tracks. He kept his eyes on the straggling line of seaweed, shells, and snags of driftwood that marked the water's highest reach. The tide was just turning now, the waves falling ever shorter in their pleading grasp upon the land. As the salt water retreated down the black sand, it would bear the worn molars of shale and tangles of kelp that now hid beneath the waves. On the other side of Other's Island, his two-masted ship was anchored in Deception Cove. He had brought the Marietta in to anchor there as the morning winds had blown the last of the storm clean of the sky. The tide had still been rising then, the fanged rocks of the notorious cove grudgingly receding beneath frothy green lace. The ship's gig had scraped over and between the barnacled rocks to put him and Gankus ashore on a tiny crescent of black sand beach that disappeared completely when storm winds drove the waves up past the high tide marks. Above, slate cliffs loomed and evergreens, so dark they were nearly black, leaned precariously out in defiance of the prevailing winds. Even to Kenneth's iron nerves, it was like stepping into some creature's half-open mouth. They'd left Opal, the ship's boy, with the gig to protect it from the bizarre mishaps that so often befell unguarded craft in Deception Cove. Much to the boy's unease, Kenneth had commanded Genghis to come with him, leaving the boy and boat alone. At Kenneth's last sight, the boy had been perched in the beached boat. His eyes had alternated between fearful glances over his shoulder at the forested cliff tops and staring anxiously out to where the Marietta strained against her anchors, yearning to join the racing current that swept past the mouth of the cove. The hazards of visiting this island were legendary. It was not just the hostility of the best anchorage on the island, nor the odd accidents known to befall ships and visitors. The whole of the island was enshrouded in the peculiar magic of the others. Kenneth had felt it tugging at him as he and Genghis followed the path that led from Deception Cove to the Treasure Beach. For a path seldom used, its black gravel was miraculously clean of fallen leaves or intruding plant life. About them the trees dripped the second-hand rain of last night's storm onto fern fronds already burdened with crystal drops. The air was cool and alive, brightly hued flowers, always growing at least a man's length. From the path challenged the dimness of the shaded forest floor. Their scents drifted alluringly on the morning air, as if beckoning the men to leave off their quest and explore their world. Less wholesome in appearance were the orange fungi that stair-stepped up the trunks of many of the trees. The shocking brilliance of their color spoke to Kenneth of parasitic hungers. A spider's web, hung like the ferns with fine droplets of shining water, stretched across their path, forcing them to duck under it. The spider that sat at the edges of its strands was as orange as the fungi, and nearly as big as a baby's fist. A green tree frog was enmeshed and struggling in the web's sticky strands, but the spider appeared disinterested. Genghis made a small sound of dismay as he crouched to go beneath it. This path led right through the midst of the other's realm. Here was where the nebulous boundaries of their territory could be crossed by a man, did he dare to leave the well-marked path allotted to humans and step off into the forest to seek them. In ancient times, so the tales told, heroes came here, not to follow the path but to leave it deliberately, to beard the others in their dens and seek the wisdom of their cave-imprisoned goddess, or demand gifts such as cloaks of invisibility and swords that ran with flames and could shear through any shield. Bards that had dared to come this way had returned to their homelands, with voices that could shatter a man's ears with their power, or melt the heart of any listener with their skill. All knew the ancient tale of Caven Ravenlock, who visited the others for 100 years, and returned as if but a day had passed for him, but with hair the color of gold and eyes like red coals and true songs that told of the future in twisted rhymes. Kenneth snorted softly to himself. All knew such ancient tales, but if any man had ventured to leave this path in Kenneth's lifetime, he had told no other man about it. Perhaps he had never returned to brag of it. The pirate dismissed it from his mind. He had not come to the island to leave the path, but to follow it to its very end, and all knew what waited there as well. Kenneth had followed the gravel path that snaked through the forested hills of the island's interior until its winding descent spilled them out onto a coarsely grassed tableland that framed the wide curve of an open beach. This was the opposite shore of the tiny island. Legend foretold that any ship that anchored here had only the netherworld as its next port of call. Kenneth had found no record of any ship that had dared challenge that rumor. If any had, its boldness had gone to hell with it. The sky was a clean, brisk blue scoured clean of clouds by last night's storm. The long curve of the rock and sand beach was broken only by a freshwater stream that cut its way through the high grassy bank backing the beach. The stream meandered over the sand to be engulfed in the sea. In the distance, higher cliffs of black shale rose, enclosing the far end of the crescent beach. One toothy tower of shale stood independent of the island, jutting out crookedly from the island with a small stretch of beach between it and its mother cliff. The gap in the cliff framed a blue slice of sky and restless sea. It was a fair bit of wind and surf we had last night, sir. Some folks say that the best place to walk the treasure beach is on the grassy dunes up there. They say that in a good bit of storm, the waves throw things up there, fragile things you might expect to be smashed to bits on the rocks and such, but they land on the sedge up there, just as gentle as you please. Genghis panted out the words as he trotted at Kenneth's heels. He had to stretch his stride to keep up with the tall pirate. An uncle of mine, that is to say, actually he was married to my aunt, to my mother's sister. He said he knew a man found a little wooden box up there, shiny black and all painted with flowers. Inside was a little glass statue of a woman with butterfly's wings, but not transparent glass. No, the colors of the wings were swirled right in the glass they were. Genghis stopped in his account and half-stooped his head as he glanced cautiously at his master. Would you want to know what the other said it meant? He inquired carefully. Kenneth paused to nudge the toe of his boot against a wrinkle in the wet sand. A glint of gold rewarded him. He stooped casually to hook his ringer under a fine gold chain. As he drew it up, a locket popped out of its sandy grave. He wiped the locket down the front of his fine linen trousers, and then nimbly worked the tiny catch. The gold halves popped open. Salt water had penetrated the edges of the locket, but the portrait of a young woman still smiled up at him, her eyes both merry and shyly rebuking. Kenneth merely grunted at his find and put it in the pocket of his brocaded waistcoat. Captain, you know they won't let you keep that. No one keeps anything from the treasure beach, Genghis pointed out gingerly. Don't they? Kenneth queried in return. He put a twist of amusement in his voice to watch Genghis puzzle over whether it was self-mockery or a threat. Genghis shifted his weight surreptitiously to put his face out of reach of his captain's fist. Swat they all say, sir, he replied hesitantly, that no one takes home what they find on the treasure beach. I know for sure my uncle's friend didn't. After the other looked at what he'd found and told his fortune from it, he followed the other down the beach to this rock cliff. Probably that one. Genghis lifted an arm to point at the distant shale cliffs, and in the face of it there were thousands of little holes. Little what you call M's. ... Alcoves, Kenneth supplied in an almost dreamy voice. I call them alcoves, Genghis, as would you, if you could speak your own mother tongue. Yes, sir. Alcoves, and in each was a treasure, except for those that were empty. And the other let him walk along Tie Cliff wall and look at all the treasures. And there was stuff there such as he'd never even imagined. China teacups, done all in fancy rosebuds, and gold wine cups rimmed with jewels, and little wooden toys all painted bright, and 100 things such as you can't imagine, each in an alcove, sir. And then he found an alcove the right size and shape, and he put the butterfly lady in it. He told my uncle that nothing ever felt quite so right to him as setting that little treasure into that nook. And then he left it there, and left the island and went home. Kenneth cleared his throat. The single noise conveyed more of contempt and disdain than most men could have fitted into an entire stream of abuse. Genghis looked aside and down from it. It was him that said it, sir, not me. He tugged at the waist of his worn trousers. Almost reluctantly he added, the man is a bit in the dream world, gives a seventh of all that comes his way to Saw's temple, and both his eldest children besides. Such a man don't think as we do, sir, when you think at all. Genghis, the captain concluded for him. He lifted his pale eyes to look far up the tide line, squinting slightly as the morning sun dazzled off the moving waves. Take yourself up to your sedgy cliffs, Genghis, and walk along them. Bring me whatever you find there. Yes, sir. The older pirate trudged away. He gave one rueful backward glance at his young captain. Then he clambered agilely up the short bank to the deeply grassed tableland that fronted on the beach. He began to walk a parallel course, his eyes scanning the bank ahead of him. Almost immediately, he spotted something. He sprinted toward it, then lifted an object that flashed in the morning sunlight. He raised it up to the light and gazed at it, his seamed face lit with awe. Sir, you should see what I've found. I might be able to. Did you bring it here to me as you were commanded? Kenneth observed irritably, like a dog called to heel. Genghis made his way back to the captain. His brown eyes shone with a youthful sparkle, and he clutched the treasure in both hands. As he leaped nimbly down the man-height drop to the beach, his low shoes kicked up sand as he ran. A brief frown creased Kenneth's brow as he watched Genghis advancing towards him. Although the old sailor was prone to fawn on him, he was no more inclined to share booty than any other man of his trade. Kenneth had not truly expected Genghis willingly to bring to him anything he found on the grassy bank. In fact, he had been rather anticipating divesting the man of his trove at the end of their stroll. To have Genghis hastening toward him, his face beaming as if he were a country yokel bringing his beloved milkmaid a posy, was positively unsettling. Nevertheless, Kenneth retained his customary sardonic smile, not allowing his face to betray his thoughts. It was a carefully rehearsed posture that suggested the languid grace of a hunting cat. It was not just that his greater height allowed him to look down on the seaman. By capturing his face in a pose of amusement, he suggested to his followers that they were incapable of surprising him. He wished his crew to believe that he could anticipate not only their every move, but their thoughts too. A crew that believed that of their captain was less likely to become mutinous, and if they did, no one would wish to be the first to act. And so he kept his poise as Genghis raced across the sand to him. Moreover, he did not immediately snatch the treasure away from him, but allowed the man to hold it out to him while he, Kenneth, gazed down at it in amusement. From the instant he saw it, it took all of Kenneth's control not to snatch at it. Never had he seen such a cunningly wrought bauble. It was a bubble of glass, an absolutely perfect sphere. The surface was not marred with so much as a scratch. The glass itself had a very faint blue cast to it, but the tint did not obscure the wonder within. 3 tiny figurines, garbed in motley with painted faces, were fixed to a tiny stage, and somehow linked to one another, so that when Genghis shifted the ball in his hands, it sent them off into a series of actions. One pirouetted on his toes, while the next did a series of flips over a bar. The third bobbed his head in time to their actions, as if all 3 heard and responded to a merry tune trapped inside the ball with them. Kenneth allowed Genghis to demonstrate it for him twice. Then, without a word, he extended a long-fingered hand towards him gracefully, and the sailor set the treasure in his palm. Kenneth held his bemused smile firmly as he first lifted the ball to the sunlight, and then set the tumblers within to dancing for himself. The ball did not quite fill his hand, a child's plaything, he surmised loftily. If the child were the richest prince in the world, Genghis dared to observe, it's too fragile a thing to give a kid to play with, sir. All it would take would be dropping it once. ... Yet it seems to have survived bobbing about in the waves of a storm, and then being flung up on a beach, Kenneth pointed out with measured good nature. That's true, sir, that's true. But then this is the treasure beach. Almost everything cast up here is whole. From what I've heard tell, it's part of the magic of this place. Magic. Kenneth permitted himself a slightly wider smile as he placed the orb in the roomy pocket of his indigo jacket. So you believe it is magic that sweeps such trinkets up on this shore, do you? What else, Captain? By all rights, that should have been smashed to bits, or at least scoured by the sands. Yet it looks as if it just come out of a jeweler's shop. Kenneth shook his head sadly. Magic. No, Genghis. No more magic than the riptides in the Oort shallows, or the Spice current that speeds sailing ships on their journeys to the islands and taunts them all the way back. It's but a trick of wind and current and tides. No more than that. The same trick that promises that any ship that tries to anchor off this side of the island will find herself beached and broken before the next tide. Yes, sir. Genghis agreed dutifully, but without conviction. His traitorous eyes strayed to the pocket where Captain Kenneth had stowed the glass ball. Kenneth's smile might have deepened fractionally. Well, don't loiter here. Get back up there and walk the bank and see what else you find. Yes, sir. Genghis conceded, and with one final regretful glance at the pocket, the older man turned and hastened back to the bank. Kenneth slipped his hand into his pocket and caressed the smooth cold glass there. He resumed his stroll down the beach. Overhead, gulls followed his example, sliding slowly down the wind as they searched the retreating waves for tidbits. He did not hasten, but kept in mind that on the other side of the island, his ship was awaiting him. In treacherous waters, he'd walk the whole length of the beach, as tradition decreed, but he had no intention of lingering after he had heard the soothsaying of another, nor did he have any intention of leaving whatever treasure he found. A true smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. As he strolled, he took his hand from his pocket and absently touched his opposite wrist. Concealed by the lacy cuff of his white silk shirt was a fine double thong of black leather. It bound a small wooden trinket tightly to his wrist. The ornament was a carved face pierced at the brow and lower jaw, so the face would be snugged firmly against his wrist, exactly over his pulse point. At one time, the face had been painted black, but most of that was worn away now. The features still stood out distinctly. A tiny mocking face carved with exquisite care. Its visage was twin to his own. It had cost him an inordinate amount of coin to commission it. Not everyone who could carve Wizardwood would, even if they had the balls to steal some. Kenneth remembered well the artisan who had worked the tiny face for him. He'd sat for long hours in the man's studio, washed in the cool morning light as the artist painstakingly worked the iron-hard wood to reflect Kenneth's features. They had not spoken. The artist could not. The pirate did not. The carver had needed absolute silence for his concentration, for he worked not only wood, but a spell that would bind the charm to protect the wearer from enchantments. Kenneth had had nothing to say to him anyway. The pirate had paid him an exorbitant advance months before, and waited until the artist had sent him a messenger to say that he had obtained some of the precious and jealously guarded wood. Kenneth had been outraged when the artist had demanded still more money before he would begin the carving and spell setting. But Kenneth had only smiled his small sardonic smile and put coins and jewels and silver and gold links on the artist's scales until the man had nodded that his price had been met. Like many enlightened eyes, small. The runt, most likely. It was sodden and cold and disgusting. A ruby earring like a fat tick decorated one of the wet ears. He longed to simply drop it. Ridiculous. He plucked the earring free and dropped it in his pocket. Then, moved by an impulse he did not understand, he returned the small blue bodies to the bag and left it beside the tide line. Kenneth walked on. Awe flowed through him with his blood. Tree, bark and sap, the scent of the wood and the leaves fluttering overhead. Tree, but also the soil and the water, the air and the light. All was coming and going through the being known as tree. He moved with them, sliding in and out of an existence of bark and leaf, and root, air and water. Wintro. The boy lifted his eyes slowly from the tree before him. With an effort of will, he focused his gaze on the smiling face of the young priest. Barandal nodded in encouragement. Wintro closed his eyes for an instant, held his breath, and pulled himself free of his task. When he opened his eyes, he took a sudden breath as if breaking clear of deep water, dappling light, sweet water, soft wind. All faded abruptly. He was in the monastery workroom, a cool hall, walled and floored with stone. His bare feet were chill against the floor. There were a dozen other slab tables in the big room. At 3 others, boys like himself worked slowly, their dreamlike movements indicative of their tranced state. One wove a basket, and 2 others shaped clay with wet gray hands. He looked down at the pieces of gleaming glass and lead on the table before him. The beauty of the stained glass image he had pieced together astonished even him. Yet it still could not touch the wonder of having been the tree. He touched it with his fingers, tracing the trunk and the graceful branches. Caressing the image was like touching his own body. He knew it that well. Behind him he heard the soft intake of Barandal's breath. In his state of still heightened awareness, he could feel the priest's awe flowing with his own, and for a time they stood quietly, glorying together in the wonder of Saw. Wintro, the priest repeated softly. He reached out and traced with a finger the tiny dragon that peered from the tree's upper branches, then touched the glistening curve of a serpent's body, all but hidden in the twisting roots. He put a hand on the boy's shoulders and turned him gently away from his work table. As he steered him from the workroom, he rebuked him gently. You are too young to sustain such a state for the whole morning. You must learn to pace yourself. Wintro lifted his hands to knuckle at eyes that were suddenly sandy. I've been in there all morning, he asked dazedly. It did not seem like it. Barandal, I am sure it did not. Yet I am sure the weariness you feel now will convince you it is so. One must be careful, Wintro. Tomorrow, ask a watcher to stir you at mid-morning. Talent such as you possess is too precious to allow you to burn it out. I do ache now, Wintro conceded. He ran his hand over his brow, pushing fine black hair from his eyes and smiled. But the tree was worth it, Barandal. Barandal nodded slowly. In more ways than one, the sale of such a window will yield enough coin to re-roof the novitiate's hall. If Mother Delity can bring herself to let the monastery part with such a thing of wonder. He hesitated a moment, then added, I see they appeared again. The dragon and the serpent. You still have no idea. He let his voice trail away questioningly. I do not even have a recollection of putting them there, Wintro said. Well, there was no trace of judgment in Barandal's voice, only patience. For a time they walked in companionable silence through the coolstone hallways of the monastery. Slowly, Wintrow's senses lost their edge and faded to a normal level. He could no longer taste the sense of the salts trapped in the stone walls, nor hear the minute settling of the ancient blocks of stone. The rough brown bure of his novice robes became bearable against his skin. By the time they reached the great wooden door and stepped out into the monastery gardens, he was safely back in his body. He felt groggy, as if he had just awakened from a long sleep, yet as bone-weary as if he had hoed potatoes all day. He walked silently beside Barandal as monastery custom dictated. They passed others, some men and women robed in the green of full priesthood and others dressed in white as acolytes. Greetings were exchanged as nods. As they neared the tool shed, he felt a sudden unsettling certainty that they were going there, and that he would spend the rest of the afternoon working in the sunny garden. Any other time, it might have been a pleasant thing to look forward to, but his recent efforts in the dim workroom had left his eyes sensitive to light. Barandal glanced back at his lagging step. Wintrow, he chided softly, refuse the anxiety. When you borrow trouble against what might be, you neglect the moment you have now to enjoy. The man who worries about what will next be happening to him loses this moment in dread of the next, and poisons the next with prejudgment. Barandal's voice took on an edge of hardness. You indulge in prejudgment too often. If you are refused the priesthood, it will most likely be for that. Wintrow's eyes flashed to Barandal's in horror. For a moment, stark desolation dominated his face. Then he saw the trap. His face broke into a grin, and Barandal's answered it when the boy said, "But if I fret about it, I shall have prejudged myself to failure." Barandal gave the slender boy a good-natured shove with his elbow. Exactly. Ah, you grow and learn so fast. I was much older than you, 20 at least, before I learned to apply that contradiction to daily life. Wintrow shrugged sheepishly. I was meditating on it last night before I fell asleep. One must plan for the future and anticipate the future without fearing the future. The 27th contradiction of Saw. 13 years old is very young to have reached the 27th contradiction, Barandal observed. What one are you on? Wintrow asked artlessly. The 33rd, the same one I've been on for the last 2 years. Wintrow gave a small shrug of his shoulders. I haven't studied that far yet. They walked in the shade of apple trees, under leaves hanging limp in the heat of the day. Ripening fruit weighted the boughs. At the other end of the orchard, acolytes moved in patterns through the trees, bearing buckets of water from the stream. A priest should not presume to judge unless he can judge as Saw does, with absolute justice and absolute mercy. Barandal shook his head. I confess, I do not see how that is possible. The boy's eyes were already turned inward, with only the slightest line to his brow. As long as you believe it is impossible, you close your mind to understanding it. His voice seemed far away. Unless, of course, that is what we are meant to discover. That as priests we cannot judge, for we have not the absolute mercy and absolute justice to do so. Perhaps we are only meant to forgive and give solace. Barandal shook his head. In the space of a few moments, you slice through as much of the knot as I had done in 6 months. But then I look about me, and I see many priests who do judge. The wanderers of our order do little except resolve differences for folk, so they must have somehow mastered the 33rd contradiction. The boy looked up at him curiously. He opened his mouth to speak and then blushed and shut it again. Barandal glanced down at his charge. Whatever it is, go ahead and say it. I will not rebuke you. The problem is, I was about to rebuke you, Wintrow confessed. The boy's face brightened as he added, but I stopped myself before I did. And you were going to say to me? Barandal pressed. When the boy shook his head, his tutor laughed aloud. Come, Wintrow, having asked you to speak, your thought. Do you think I would be so unfair as to take offense at your words? What was in your mind? I was going to tell you that you should govern your behavior by the precepts of Saw, not by what you see others doing. The boy spoke forthrightly, but then lowered his eyes. I know it is not my place to remind you of that. Barandal looked too deep in thought to have taken offense. But if I follow the precept alone, and my heart tells me it is impossible for a man to judge as Saw does, with absolute justice and absolute mercy, then I must conclude ... His words slowed as if the thought came reluctantly. I must conclude that either the wanderers have much greater spiritual depth than I, or that they have no more right to judge than I do. His eyes wandered among the apple trees. Could it be that an entire branch of our order exists without righteousness? Is not it disloyal even to think such a thing? His troubled glance came back to the boy at his side. Winthrop smiled serenely. If a man's thoughts follow the precepts of Sa, they cannot go astray. I shall have to think more on this, Barandal concluded with a sigh. He gave Winthrop a look of genuine fondness. I bless the day you were given me as student. Though in truth I often wonder who is student and who is teacher here. I shall miss you. Sudden alarm filled Wintrop's eyes. Miss me? Are you leaving? Have you been called to duty so soon? Not I should have given you this news better. But as always your words have led my thoughts far from their starting point. I am not leaving, but you. It was why I came to find you today, to bid you pack, for you are called home. Your grandmother and mother have sent word that they fear your grandfather is dying. They would have you near at such a time. At the look of devastation on the boy's face, Barandal added, I am sorry to have told you so bluntly. You so seldom speak of your family. I did not realize you were close to your grandfather. I am not, Winthrop simply admitted. Truth to tell, I scarcely know him. When I was small, he was always at sea. At the times when he was home, he always terrified me, not with cruelty, but with power. Everything about him seemed too large for the room, from his voice to his beard. Even when I was small and overheard other folk talking about him, it was as if they spoke of a legend or a hero. I don't recall that I ever called him Grandpa, nor even grandfather. When he came home, he'd blow through the house like the north wind, and mostly I took shelter from his presence rather than enjoyed it. When I was dragged out before him, all I can recall was that he found fault with my growth. Why is the boy so puny? He'd demand. He looks just like my boys, but half the size. Don't you feed him meat? Doesn't he eat well? Then he would pull me near and feel my arm, as if I were being fattened for the table. I always felt ashamed of my size, then as if it were a fault. Since I was given over to the priesthood, I have seen even less of him, but my impression of him has not changed. Still, it is not my grandfather I dread, nor even keeping his death watch. It's going home, Barandal. It is so noisy. Barandal grimaced in sympathy. I don't believe I even learned to think until I came here. Winthrop continued. There, it was too noisy and too busy. I never had time to think. From the time Nana rousted us out of bed in the morning until we were bathed, gowned, and dumped back in bed at night, we were in motion, being dressed and taken on outings, having lessons and meals, visiting friends, being dressed differently, and having more meals. It was endless. You know, when I first got here, I didn't leave my cell for the first 2 days without Nana or Grandma or Mother chazzing me about. I had no idea what to do with myself, and for so long, my sister and I had been a unit. The children need their nap, the children need their lunch. I felt I'd lost half my body when they separated us. Barandal was grinning in appreciation. So that is what it is like to be a Vestrit. I'd always wondered how the children of the old traders of Bingtown lived. For me, it was very different, and yet much the same. We were swineherds, my family. I had no nanny or outings, but there were always chores aplenty to keep one busy. Looking back, we spent most of our time simply surviving, stretching out the food, fixing things long past fixing by anyone else's standards, caring for the swine. I think the pigs received better care than anyone else. There was never even a thought of giving up a child for the priesthood. Then my mother became ill, and my father made a promise that, if she lived, he would dedicate one of his children to Sa. So when she lived, they sent me off. I was the runt of the litter, so to speak, the youngest surviving child, and with a stunted arm. It was a sacrifice for them, I am sure, but not as great as giving up one of my strapping older brothers. A stunted arm? Winthrop asked in surprise. It was. I'd fallen on it when I was small, and it was a long time healing, and when it did heal, it was never as strong as it should have been, but the priests cured me. They put me with the watering crew on the orchard, and the priest in charge of us gave me mismatched buckets. He made me carry the heavier one. With my weaker arm, I thought he was a madman at first. My parents had always taught me to use my stronger arm for everything. It was my earliest introduction to Sa's precepts. Winthrop frowned to himself for a moment, then grinned. For the weakest has but to try his strength to find it. and then he shall be strong. Exactly. The priest gestured at the long, low building before them. The acolyte cells had been their destination. The messenger was delayed getting here. You will have to pack swiftly and set out right away if you are to reach port before your ship sails. It's a long walk. A ship. The desolation that had faded briefly from Wintrow's face flooded back. I hadn't thought of that. I hate traveling by sea. But when one must go from Jamalia to Bingtown, there is no other choice. His frown deepened. Walk to port. Didn't they arrange a man and a horse for me? Do you so quickly revive to the comforts of wealth, Wintrow? Barandal chided him. When the boy hung his head, abashed, he went on. No, the message said that a friend had offered you passage across, and the family had been glad to accept it. More gently he added, I suspect that money is not so plentiful for your family as it once was. The Northern War has hurt many of the trading families, both in the goods that never came down the Buck River, and those that never were sold there. More pensively, he went on, an hour. Young Satrap does not favor Bingtown as his father and grandfathers did. They seemed to feel that those brave enough to settle the cursed shores should share generously in the treasures they found there, but not young Cosgo. It is said that he feels they have reaped the reward of their risk-taking long enough, that the shores are well settled and whatever curse was once there is now dispersed. He has not only sent them new taxes, but has parceled out new grants of land near Bingtown to some of his favorites. Barandal shook his head. He breaks the word of his ancestor and causes hardship for folk who have always kept their word with him. No good can come of this. I know. I should be grateful I am not afoot all the way, but it is hard, Barandal, to accept a journey to a destination I dread, let alone by ship. I shall be miserable the whole way. Seasick? Barandal asked in some surprise. I did not think it afflicted those of seafaring stock. The right weather can sour any man's stomach. But no, that is not it. It's the noise and the rushing about and the crowded conditions, the smell, and the sailors. Good enough men in their own way. But the boy shrugged. Not like us. They haven't the time to talk about the things we speak of here, Barandal. And if they did, their thoughts would likely be as basic as that of the youngest acolyte. They live as animals do, and reason as animals. I shall feel as if I am living among beasts, through no faults of their own, he added seeing the young priest frown. Barandal took a breath as if to launch into speech, then reconsidered it. After a moment, he said thoughtfully, It has been 2 years since you have visited your parents' home, Wintrow. 2 years since you last were out of the monastery and about working folk. Look and listen well, and when you come back to us, tell me if you still agree with what you have just said. I charge you to remember this, for I shall, Barandal, the youth promised sincerely, and I shall miss you, probably, but not for some days, for I am to escort you on your journey down to the port. Come, let's go and pack. Long before Kenneth reached the end of the beach, he was aware of the other watching him. He had expected this, yet it intrigued him, for he had often heard they were creatures of the dawn and the dusk, seldom moving about. While the sun was still in the sky, a lesser man might have been afraid, but a lesser man would not have possessed Kenneth's luck, or his skill with a sword. He continued his leisurely stroll down the beach, all the while gathering plunder. He feigned unawareness of the creature watching him, yet he was eerily certain that it knew of his deceit. A game within a game, he told himself, and smiled secretly. He was immensely irritated when, a few moments later, Genghis came lolloping down the beach to wheeze out the news that there was another up there, watching him. I know, he told the old sailor with asperity. An instant later he had regained control of his voice and features. In a kindly tone, he explained, and it knows that we know it is watching us. That being so, I suggest you ignore it, as I do, and finish searching your bank. Have you found anything else of note? A few things, Genghis admitted, not pleased. Kenneth straightened and waited. The sailor dug into the capacious pockets of his worn coat. There's this, he said as he reluctantly drew an object of brightly painted wood from his pocket. It was an arrangement of discs and rods with circular holes in some of the discs. Kenneth found it incomprehensible. A child's toy of some kind, he deemed it. He raised his eyebrow at Genghis and waited. And this, the seaman conceded. He took a rose bud from his pocket. Kenneth took it from him carefully, wary of the thorns. He had actually believed it real, until the moment that he held it and found the stem stiff and unyielding. He hefted it in his hand. It was as light as a real rose would be. He turned it, trying to decide what it was made from. He concluded it was nothing he had ever seen before. Even more mysterious than its structure was its fragrance, as warm and spicy as if it were a full-blown rose from a summer garden. Kenneth raised one eyebrow at Genghis as he fastened the rose to the lapel of his jacket. The barbed thorns held it securely. Kenneth watched Genghis's lips fold tight, but the seaman dared no words. Kenneth glanced at the sun, and then at the ebbing waves. It would take them over an hour to walk back to the other side of the island. He could not stay much longer without risking his ship on the rocks exposed by the retreating tide. A rare moment of indecision clouded his thoughts. He had not come to the treasure beach for treasure alone. He had come instead seeking the oracle of the other, confident that the other would choose to speak to him. He needed the confirmation of the oracle. Was not that why he had brought Genghis with him to witness? Genghis was one of the few men aboard his ship who did not routinely embroider his own adventures. He knew that not only his own crew members but any pirate at Divvytown would accept Genghis's account as true. Besides, if the oracle that Genghis witnessed did not suit Kenneth's purposes, he'd be an easy man to kill. Once again he considered the amount of time left to him. A prudent man would stop his search of the beach now, confront the other, and then hasten back to his ship. Prudent men never trusted their luck, but Kenneth had long ago decided that a man had to trust his luck in order for it to grow. It was a personal belief, one he had discovered for himself and saw no reason to share with anyone else. He had never achieved any major triumph without taking a chance and trusting his luck. Perhaps the day he became prudent and cautious, his luck would take insult and desert him. He smirked to himself as he concluded that would be the one chance he would not take. He would never trust to luck that his luck would not desert him. This convolution of logic pleased him. He continued his leisurely search of the tide line. As he neared the toothy rocks that marked the end of the crescent beach, every one of his senses prickled with awareness of the other. The smell of it was alluringly sweet, and then abruptly it became rancidly rotten when the wind changed and brought it stronger. The scent was so strong it became a taste in the back of his throat, one that almost gagged him. But it was not just the smell of the beast. Kenneth could feel its presence against his skin. His ears popped and he felt its breathing as a pressure on his eyeballs and on the skin of his throat. He did not think he perspired, yet his face suddenly felt greasy with sweat, as if the wind had carried some substance from the other skin and pasted it onto his. Kenneth fought distaste that bordered on nausea. He refused to let that weakness show. Instead, he drew himself up to his full height and unobtrusively straightened his waistcoat. The wind stirred both the plumes on his hat and the gleaming black locks of his hair. Generally speaking, he cut a fine figure and drew a great deal of power from knowing that both men and women were impressed by him. He was tall, but muscled proportionately. The tailoring of his coat showed off the breadth of his shoulders and chest and the flatness of his belly. His face pleased him, too. He felt he was a handsome man. He had a high brow, a firm jaw, and a straight nose over finely drawn lips. His beard was fashionably pointed, the ends of his mustache meticulously waxed. His only feature that displeased him were his eyes. They were his mother's eyes, pale and watery and blue. When he encountered their stare in a looking glass, she looked out of them at him, distressed and teary at his dissolute ways. They seemed to him the vacuous eyes of an idiot, out of place in his tan face. In another man, folk would have said he had mild blue eyes, inquiring eyes. Kenneth strove to cultivate a cold blue stare, but knew his eyes were too pale even for that. He augmented the effort with a slight curl of his lip as he let his eyes come to rest on the waiting other. It seemed little impressed. It returned his stare from a height near equal to his own. It was oddly reassuring to find how accurate the legends were. The webbed fingers and toes, the obvious flexibility of the limbs, the flat fish eyes in their cartilaginous sockets, even the supple scaled skin that covered the creature were all as Kenneth had expected. Its blunt, bald head was misshapen, neither that of a human nor a fish. The hinge of its jaw was under its ear holes, anchoring a mouth large enough to engulf a man's head. Its thin lips could not conceal the rows of tiny sharp teeth. Its shoulders seemed to slump forward, but the posture suggested brute strength rather than slovenliness. It wore a garment somewhat like a cloak, of a pale azure, and the weave was so fine that It had no more texture than a flower petal. It draped the other in a way that suggested the fluidity of water. Yes, all was as he had read of it. What he had not expected was the attraction he felt. Some trick of the wind had lied to his nose. This creature's scent was like a summer garden, the air of its breath, the subtle bouquet of a rare wine. All wisdom resided in those unreadable eyes. He suddenly longed to distinguish himself before it and be deemed worthy of its regard. He wanted to impress it with his goodness and intelligence. He longed for it to think well of him. He heard the slight crunch of Gankis's footfalls on the sand behind him. For an instant, the other's attention wavered. The flat eyes slid away from contemplating Kenneth, and in that moment the glamour was broken. Kenneth, almost startled. Then he crossed his arms on his chest so that the Wizardwood face pressed into his flesh securely. Quickened or not, it had seemed to work, holding off the creature's enchantment. And now that he was aware of the other's intent, he could hold his will firm against such manipulation. Even when its eyes darted back to lock with Kenneth's gaze, he could see the other for what it was, a cold and squamous creature of the deep. It seemed to sense it, had lost its hold on him, for when it filled the air pouches behind its jaws and belched its words at him, Kenneth sensed a trace of sarcasm. "Welcome, pilgrim. The sea has well rewarded your search, I see. Will you make a goodwill offering and hear the oracle speak the significance of your finds?" Its voice creaked like unoiled hinges as it wheezed and gasped words at him. Hey! Part of Kenneth admired the effort it must have taken for it to learn to shape human words, but the harder side of him dismissed it as a servile act. Here was this creature, foreign in every way to his humanity. He stood before it on its own territory, and yet it waited upon him, speaking in his tongue, begging alms in exchange for its prophecies. Yet if it recognized him as superior, why was there sarcasm in its voice? Kenneth dismissed the question from his mind. He reached for his purse and took from it the 2 gold bits that were the customary offering. Despite his earlier dissembling with Gankis, he had researched exactly what he might expect. Good luck works best when it is not surprised, so he was unruffled when the other extended a stiff, grayish tongue to receive the coins, and he did not shrink from placing them there. The creature jerked its tongue back into its maw. If it did aught with the gold other than swallow it, Kenneth could not tell. That done, the other gave a stiff sort of bow, and then smoothed a fan of sand to receive the objects Kenneth had gathered. Kenneth took his time in spreading them out before it. He set down first the glass ball with the tumblers within it. Beside it he placed the rose, and then he carefully arranged the 12 fingernails around it. At the end of the arc he placed the small chest with the tiny cups in it, a handful of small crystal spheres he nested in a hollow. He had gathered them on the final stretch of beach. Beside them he set his final find, a copper feather that seemed to weigh little more than a real one. He gave a nod that he was finished and stepped back slightly, with an apologetic glance at his captain. Gankis shyly placed the painted wooden toy to one side of the ark. Then he, too, stood back. The other looked for a time at the fan of treasures before it. Then it lifted its oddly flat eyes to meet Kenneth's blue stare. It finally spoke. "This is all you found." The emphasis was unmistakable. Kenneth made a tiny movement of his shoulders and head, a movement that might mean yes or no, or nothing at all. He did not speak. Gankis shifted his feet about uncomfortably. The other refilled its air sacs noisily. "That which the ocean washes up here is not for the keeping of men. The water brings it here because here is where the water wishes it to be. Do not set yourself against the will of the water, for no wise creature does that. No human is permitted to keep what he finds upon the treasure beach." "Does it belong to the other, then?" Kenneth asked calmly. Despite the difference in species, it was still easy for Kenneth to see he had disconcerted the other. It took a moment to recover, then answered gravely, "What the ocean washes up upon the treasure beach belongs always to the ocean. We are but caretakers here." Kenneth's smile stretched, his lips tight and thin. "Well then, you need have no concern. I'm Captain Kenneth, and I'm not the only one who will tell you that all. The ocean is mine to rove, so all that belongs to the ocean is mine as well. You've had your gold. Now speak your prophecy, and take no more care for that which does not belong to you." Beside him Gankis gasped audibly, but the other gave no sign of reacting to these words. Instead it bowed its head gravely, inclining its necklace body toward him, almost as if compelled to acknowledge Kenneth as its master. Then it lifted its head and its fish eyes found Kenneth's soul as unerringly as a finger on a chart. When it spoke, there was a deeper note to its voice, as if the words were blown up from deep inside it. So plain, this telling that even one of your spawn could read it. You take that, which is not yours, Captain Kenneth, and claim it as your own. No matter how much falls into your hands, you are never sated. Those that follow you must be content with what you have cast off as gewgaws and toys, while you take what you perceive as most valuable and keep it for yourself. The creature's eyes darted briefly to lock with Gankis's goggling stare. In his evaluations, you are both deceived and both made the poorer. Kenneth did not care at all for the direction of this soothsaying. My gold has bought me the right to ask one question, has it not? He demanded boldly. The other's jaw dropped open wide, not in astonishment, but perhaps as a sort of threat. The rows of teeth were indeed impressive. Then it snapped shut. The thin lips barely stirred as it belched out its answer. Yes. Shall I succeed in what I aspire? The other's air sacs pulsed speculatively. You do not wish to make your question more specific? Do the omens need me to be more specific? Kenneth asked with tolerance. The other glanced down at the array of objects again. The rose, the cups, the nails, the tumblers inside the ball, the feather, the crystal spheres. You will succeed in your heart's desire, it said succinctly. A smile began to dawn on Kenneth's face, but faded as the creature continued, his tone growing more ominous. That which you are most driven to do, you will accomplish. That task, that feat, that deed which haunts your dreams will blossom in your hands. Enough, Kenneth growled, suddenly hasty. He abandoned any thought of asking for an audience with their goddess. This was as far as he wished to press their soothsaying. He stooped to retrieve the prizes on the sand, but the creature suddenly fanned out its long-fingered, webbed hands and spread them protectively above the treasures. A drop of venom welled greenly to the tip of each digit. The treasures, of course, will remain on the treasure beach. I will see to their placement. Why, thank you, Kenneth said, his voice melodic with sincerity. He straightened slowly, but as the creature relaxed its guard, he suddenly stepped forward, planting his foot firmly on the glass ball with the tumblers inside. It gave way with a tinkle like wind chimes. Gankis cried out as if Kenneth had slain his firstborn, and even the other recoiled at the wanton destructiveness. A pity, Kenneth observed as he turned away. But if I cannot possess it, why should anyone? Wisely, he forbore a similar treatment for the rose. He suspected its delicate beauty was created from some material that would not give way to his boots' pressure. He did not wish to lose his dignity by attempting to destroy it, and failing. The other objects had small value in his regard. The other could do whatever it wished with such flotsam. He turned and strode away. Behind him he heard the other hiss its wrath. It took a long breath, then intoned, "The heel that destroys that which belongs to the sea shall be claimed in turn by the sea." Its toothy jaws shut with a snap, biting off this last prophecy. Gankis immediately moved to flank Kenneth. That one would always prefer the known danger to the unknown. Half a dozen strides down the beach, Kenneth halted and turned. He called back to where the other still crouched, over the treasures. Oh, yes, there was one other omen that perhaps you might wish to consider, but methinks the ocean washed it to you, not me, and thus I left it where it was. It is well known, I believe, that the others have no love for cats. Actually, their fear and awe of anything feline was almost as legendary as their ability to soothsay. The other did not deign to reply, but Kenneth had the satisfaction of seeing its air sacs puff with alarm. You'll find them up the beach. A whole litter of kits for you, with very pretty blue coats. They were in a leather bag. 7 or 8 of the pretty little creatures. Most of them looked a bit poorly after their dip in the ocean. But no doubt those I let out will fare well. Do remember they belong not to you, but the ocean. I'm sure you'll treat them kindly. The other made a peculiar sound, almost a whistle. Take them, it begged. Take them away, all of them, please. Take away from the treasure beach that which the ocean saw fit to bring here. I would not dream of it, Kenneth assured him with vast sincerity. He did not laugh, nor even smile as he turned away from its evident distress. He did find himself humming the tune to a rather bawdy song currently popular in Divvytown. The length of his stride was such that Genghis was soon puffing again as he trotted along beside him. "Sir," Genghis gasped, "a question if I might, Captain Kennet." "You may ask it," Kennet granted him graciously. He half expected the man to ask him to slow down, but he would refuse. They must make all haste back to the ship if they were to work her out to sea before the rocks emerged from the retreating tide. "What is it that you'll succeed in doing?" Kennet opened his mouth, almost tempted to tell the man, but no, he had schemed this too carefully, staged it all in his mind too often. He'd wait until they were underway, and Genghis had had plenty of time to tell all the crew his version of events on the island. He doubted that would take long. The old hand was garrulous, and after their absence the men would be eaten with curiosity about their visit to the island. Once they had the wind in their sails and were fairly back on their way to Divvytown, then he'd call all hands up on deck. His imagination began to carry him, and he pictured the moon shining down on him as he spoke to the men gathered below him in the waist. His pale blue eyes kindled with the glow of his own imaginings. They traversed the beach much faster than they had when they were seeking treasure. In a short time they were climbing the steep trail that led up from the shore and through the wooded interior of the island. He kept well concealed from Genghis the anxiety he felt for the Marietta. The tides in the cove both rose and fell with an extremity that paid no attention to the phases of the moon. A ship believed to be safely anchored in the cove might abruptly find her hull grinding against rocks that surely had not been there at the last low tide. Kennet would take no chances with his Marietta. They'd be well away from this sorcerous place before the tide could strand her, away from the wind of the beach and in the shelter of the trees. The day was still and golden. The warmth of the slanting sunlight through the open branched trees combined with the rising scents of the forest loam to make the day enticingly sleepy. Kennet felt his stride slowing as the peace of the golden place seeped into him. Earlier, when the branches had been dripping with the aftermath of the storm's rain, the forest had been uninviting, a dank wet place, full of brambles and slapping branches. Now he knew with unflagging certainty that the forest was a place of marvels. It had treasures and secrets, every bit as tantalizing as those the treasure beach had offered. His urgency to reach the Marietta peeled away from him and was discarded. He found himself standing still in the middle of the pebbled pathway. Today, he would explore the island. To him would be open the wonder-filled fey places of the other, where a man might pass 100 years in a single sublime night. Soon he would know and master it all, but for now it was enough to stand still and breathe the golden air of this place. Nothing intruded on his pleasure, save Genghis. The man persisted in chattering warnings about the tide in the Marietta. The more Kennet ignored him, the more he pelted him with questions. "Why have we stopped here, Captain Kennet?" "Sir, are you feeling well, sir?" He waved a dismissive hand at the man, but the old tar paid it no attention. He cast about for some errand that would take the noisy, smelly man from his presence. As he groped in his pockets, his hand encountered the locket and chain. He smiled slyly to himself as he drew it out. He interrupted whatever it was Genghis was blithering about. "Ah, this will never do. See what I've accidentally carried off from their beach. Be a good lad now, and run this back to the beach for me. Give it to the other and see it puts it safely away." Genghis gaped at him. "There isn't time. Leave it here, sir. We've got to get back to the ship before she's on the rocks, or they have to leave without us. There won't be another tide that will let her back into Deception Cove for a month, and no man survives a night on this island." The man was beginning to get on his nerves. His loud voice had frightened off a tiny green bird that had been on the point of alighting nearby. "Go, I told you. Go." He put whips and fetters into his voice, and was relieved when the old sea dog snatched the locket from his hand and dashed back the way they had come. Once he was out of sight, Kennet grinned widely to himself. He hastened up the path into the island's hilly interior. He'd put some distance between himself and where he'd left Genghis, and then he'd leave the trail. Genghis would never find him. He'd be forced to leave without him, and then all the wonders of the other's island would be his. Not quite. You would be theirs. It was his own voice speaking, in a tiny whisper so soft that even Kennet's keen ears barely heard it. He moistened his lips and looked about himself. The words had shivered through him like a sudden awakening. He'd been about to do something. What? You were about to put yourself into their hands. Power flows both ways on this path. The magic encourages you to stay upon it. but it cannot be worked to appeal to a human without also working to repel the other. The magic that keeps their world safe from you also protects you as long as you do not stray from the path. If they persuade you to leave the path, you'll be well within their reach. Not a wise move. He lifted his wrist to a level with his eyes. His own miniature face grinned mockingly back at him, with the charms quickening. The wood had taken on colors. The carved ringlets were as black as his own, the face as weathered, and the eyes as deceptively weak a blue. I had begun to think you a bad bargain, Kenneth said to the charm. The face gave a snort of disdain. If I am a bad bargain to you, you are as much a one to me, it pointed out. I was beginning to think myself strapped to the wrist of a gullible fool, doomed to almost immediate destruction. But you seem to have shaken the effect of the spell, or rather, I have cloven it from you. What spell? Kenneth demanded. The charm's lip curled in a disdainful smile. The reverse of the one you felt on the way here. All succumb to it that tread this path. The magic of the other is so strong that one cannot pass through their lands without feeling it and being drawn toward it, so they settle upon this path a spell of procrastination. One knows that their lands beckon, but one puts off visiting them until tomorrow, always tomorrow, and hence never. But your little threat about the kittens has unsettled them a bit. They would lure from the path and use as a tool to be rid of the cats. Kenneth permitted himself a small smile of satisfaction. They did not foresee I might have a charm that would make me proof against their magic. The charm pressed its mouth. I but made you aware of the spell. Awareness of any spell is the strongest charm against it. Of myself, I have no magic to fling back at them or use to deaden their own. The face's blue eyes shifted back and forth. And we may yet both meet our destruction if you stand about here talking to me. The tide retreats. Soon the mate must choose between abandoning you here or letting the Marietta be devoured by the rocks. Best you hasten for Deception Cove. Genghis, Kenneth exclaimed in dismay. He cursed, but began to run. Useless to go back for the man. He'd have to abandon him, and he'd given him the golden locket as well. What a fool he'd been to be so gulled by the others. Magic. Well, he'd lost his witness and the souvenir he'd intended to carry off with him. He'd be damned if he'd lose his life or his ship as well. His long legs stretched as he pelted down the winding path. The golden sunlight that had earlier seemed so appealing was suddenly only a very hot afternoon that seemed to withhold the very air from his straining lungs. A thinning of the trees ahead alerted him that he was nearly to the cove. Instants later, he heard the drumming of Genkis's feet on the path behind him, and was shocked when the sailor passed him without hesitation. Kenneth had a brief glimpse of his lined face contorted with terror, and then he saw the sailor's worn boots flinging up gravel from the path as he ran ahead. Kenneth had thought he could not run any faster, but he suddenly put on a burst of speed that carried him out of the sheltering trees and onto the beach. He heard Genghis crying out to the ship's boy to wait. The lad had evidently decided to give up on his captain's return, for he had pushed and dragged the gig out over the seaweed and barnacle-coated rocks to the retreating edge of the water. A cry went up from the anchored ship at the sight of Kenneth and Genghis emerging onto the beach. On the afterdeck, a sailor waved at them frantically to hurry. The Marietta was in grave circumstances. The retreating tide had left her almost aground. Straining sailors were already laboring at the anchor windlass. As Kenneth watched, the Marietta gave a tiny sideways list and then slid from atop a bared rock as a wave briefly lifted her clear. His heart stood still in his chest. Next to himself, he treasured his ship above all other things. His boots slipped on squidgy kelp and crushed barnacles as he scrambled down the rocky shore after the boy and gig. Genghis was ahead of him. No orders were necessary as all three seized the gunwales of the gig and ran her out into the retreating waves. They were soaked before the last one scrambled inside her. Genghis and the boy seized the oars and set them in place while Kenneth took his place in the stern. The Marietta's anchor was rising, festooned with seaweed. Oars battled with sails as the distance between the two craft grew smaller. Then the gig was alongside, the tackles lowered and hooked, and but a few moments later Kenneth was astride his own deck. The mate was at the wheel, and the instant he saw his captain safely aboard, Sorker swung the wheel and bellowed the orders that would give the ship her head. Wind filled the Marietta's sails and flung her out against the incoming tide into the racing current that would buffet her but carry her away from the bared teeth of Deception Cove. A glance about the deck showed Kenneth that all was in order. The ship's boy cowered when the captain's eyes swept over him. Kenneth merely looked at him, and the boy knew his disobedience would not be forgotten nor overlooked. Pity. The boy had had a sweet, smooth back tomorrow that would no longer be. So, tomorrow would be soon enough to deal with him. Let him look forward to it for a time and savor the stripes his cowardice had bought him. With no more than a nod to the mate, Kenneth sought his own quarters. Despite the near mishap, his heart thundered with triumph. He had bested the others at their own game. His luck had held, as it always had. The costly charm on his wrist had quickened and proved its value. And best of all, he had the oracle of the others themselves to give the cloak of prophecy to his ambitions. He would be the first king of the Pirate Isles.